Americans now say you need $1.8 million to retire comfortably. That number is everywhere. A study comes out, a big survey publishes, the media grabs the headline, and suddenly the whole country starts talking as if $1.8 million fell down from the mountain, carved in stone by somebody who actually knows your life. That number is not a law of nature. It is not a commandment. It is not even a mathematical conclusion in the way people pretend it is. It is a survey answer. And survey answers have a nasty habit of turning into public myths when repeated often enough. That is what I want to talk about today, because I think a lot of people are getting discouraged by a retirement number that sounds precise, sounds sophisticated, and often has very little to do with what they actually need. If you tell a room full of Americans, how much money do you think you need to retire comfortably? Many of them will throw out a number that sounds large enough to feel safe. That does not make it correct. It only makes it emotionally satisfying. The real answer to the retirement question is much less dramatic and much more personal. How much do you actually need to retire? You need enough to support the life you're going to live. That is the first rule. Not enough to satisfy a survey. Not enough to impress a newspaper headline. Enough to fund your spending, cover your income gap, and survive the math of time. That is the whole thing. If you miss that, the rest of the retirement discussion becomes theater. Now let us start with the obvious contradiction, because this is where the media narrative begins to break apart. You hear that $1.8 million is required for a comfortable retirement. Then you look at the actual balances real people hold. 2 years ago, the median retirement account balance for Americans between 65 and 74 was around $200,000. For people 75 and older, it was closer to $130,000. Those numbers are not remotely close to $1.8 million. And yet the data also showed that 82% of adults of the L60 reported doing at least okay financially. That tells you something important immediately. Either millions of retirees are all secretly miserable and lying about it, or the amount you need to retire comfortably can be far lower than the headlines suggest, I know. Which explanation I believe? What the survey is really capturing is not a universal retirement requirement. It is a feeling. It is a broad cultural anxiety. People see inflation. They see healthcare costs. They see houses and groceries and insurance and market volatility, and they throw out a number that feels big enough to create a cushion, but feeling safer with a larger number is not the same as needing that number. Retirement math always begins with spending, always not portfolio size, not a round scary number. Spending, if you are going to spend $40,000 a year in retirement, that is one problem. If you are going to spend $80,000 a year, that is another problem. If you are going to spend $120,000 a year, now we are in a completely different zip code of math. The portfolio cannot be evaluated in isolation. It has to be evaluated against the life it is supposed to fund. Fidelity says a person should plan to spend roughly 80% of working income in retirement. So if you made $100,000 while working, they would say to plan on roughly $80,000 in retirement spending. If you were a higher earner, they sometimes lean lower, maybe 55 to 60%, because certain costs tied to work often fall away. That is a sensible framework in a general way, but the point is not whether the percentage is 80 or 60. The point is that retirement spending is tied to your life, not to some giant survey number floating in the air. That is the second rule. Retirement is not an asset target. It is an income problem. Once you understand that, the whole conversation gets simpler and much more honest. Now let us move to the centerpiece of modern retirement planning, because this is where most people hear one rule, repeat it endlessly, and never stop to ask where it came from. The 4% rule, the famous 4% rule, basically says that in your first year of retirement, you can withdraw 4% of your portfolio, then increase that dollar amount each year with inflation. And historically, you had a good chance of making it through a 30-year retirement without running out of money. That rule became the standard because people need a standard. And in fairness, it was very useful, but like most useful rules, once it became famous, people started treating it as scripture rather than as a starting point. William Bengen, the man who created the rule, built it using a conservative historical framework and a fairly simple portfolio. He looked at terrible periods for retirees, one of the most famous being someone retiring into the ugly combination of weak market returns and ugly inflation starting in 1968. He was not trying to tell people the ideal way to spend every last dollar. He was trying to tell them what would probably keep them from running out under rough conditions. That distinction matters a lot. Because if you design a rule around surviving one of the nastiest historical combinations imaginable, the rule is going to be conservative. Sometimes too conservative. Bengen himself later looked at the way retirees were actually living and dying and began to acknowledge that plenty of them were dying with too much money left over. They had followed a rule designed to prevent catastrophe, and in doing so had underspent their own lives. That is not a financial disaster in the traditional sense. But it is still a kind of failure if the whole point of the money was to improve your life and the money outlived your willingness to use it. That is why he later became more open to higher withdrawal rates, especially once broader diversification was brought into the portfolio. He discussed numbers closer to 4.5%. And in some of his own more diversified thinking, he has used something like 4.7%. Now that sounds like a small change. It is not. A change from 4% to 4.7% makes a very big difference in the amount of money you need. If you want $40,000 a year in retirement and you use a 4% rule, you need $1 million. That is just the arithmetic. 40,000 is 4% of a million, but if you use 4.7%, now you only need about $851,000. That is a difference of roughly $149,000. Same lifestyle, same $40,000 target, completely different asset requirement. Do you see what just happened? One small assumption, one small shift in how much you are willing or able to withdraw, just erased nearly $150,000 from the required nest egg. And yet the public conversation pretends as if the retirement number is one fixed mountain everybody must climb. It is nonsense. The amount depends on your spending and on the rate at which you plan to pull from the portfolio. That does not mean everyone should recklessly jump to 4.7%. I am not saying that. If you are more conservative, if you are retiring very early, if your temperament is cautious, or if your situation is fragile, then staying closer to 4% or even lower might be prudent. But you need to understand the principle retirement. Targets are sensitive to assumptions, extremely sensitive. And once you understand that, the whole $1.8 million headline starts looking a lot more like a cultural mood than a universal requirement. Now take this a step further. Suppose someone did save the full $1.8 million. At a 4.7% withdrawal rate, that gives you roughly $84,600 a year. At 4%, it gives you about $72,000 a year. Now ask yourself a simple question. How many retirees in America actually need to spend $72,000 to $84,000 a year from their portfolio alone, not their total income? Their portfolio alone, the median personal income in the United States is nowhere near that, and most people spend less in retirement than they did during peak working years. Work costs go away, payroll taxes go away, often the mortgage is lower or gone, commuting goes away, retirement is not free, but for many people it is not as expensive as full working life, which means the $1.8 million story gets even weaker because it is ignoring the other side of the retirement equation, outside income. This is where a great many people go badly wrong in both directions. Some people panic because they think only the portfolio counts. Other people get too relaxed because they assume Social Security will solve everything. The truth is that retirement math is almost always a blend. You have spending on one side, you have income sources on the other. The portfolio only needs to fill the gap. That is the third rule. Your nest egg does not need to fund your whole life if something else is already funding part of it. Social Security is the biggest example. According to the Social Security Administration, the average retirement benefit around the beginning of 2024 was about $1,907 a month. Let us even round it down to $1,800 to stay conservative. That is $21,600 a year. Now go back to our person who wants to spend $40,000 a year. If Social Security is already covering $21,600, the portfolio only needs to cover $18,400 at a 4.7% withdrawal rate. That requires a nest egg of roughly $391,000 to $412,000, depending on exactly how conservatively you want to round and frame it. That is not $1.8 million. It is not even close. Now I know what people will say. What if Social Security changes? What if the benefits are lower in the future? What if I do not want to rely on it? Those are reasonable concerns. But the point here is not to pretend those concerns do not exist. The point is to show how dramatically outside income changes the retirement requirement. A pension does the same thing, part-time income does the same thing, a small side business does the same thing, rental cash flow does the same thing. Whenever another stream covers part of your spending, the portfolio requirement shrinks. That is how this works. Now, let us talk about early retirement because this is where people get excited, confused, inspired, and occasionally delusional. If you want to retire at 67, in a traditional sense, you are solving one problem. If you want to retire at 45, you are solving a much harder problem. Why? The earlier you retire, the more years the portfolio has to support you, and the more vulnerable you are to bad sequences, inflation, and the plain arithmetic of long duration. That is why the savings rate becomes so important. I have always liked looking at early retirement through the lens of savings rate because it cuts through a lot of nonsense. Income matters. Yes. Returns matter. Yes. But savings rate often matters most because it attacks the problem from two sides at once. If you save a lot, you are building the portfolio faster. And if you save a lot, you are proving you can live on less. That is a very powerful combination. Someone saving 70% of income can theoretically reach financial independence very quickly compared with someone saving 20%. If you earn $75,000 and save 70%, the math can point to something like 7 years to retirement in a simplified framework. Drop that to 50%, maybe you are closer to 12 years, drop it to 20%. Now you are talking more like 26 or 27 years. At 10%, the timeline can stretch into half a century. The reason is not mysterious. A high savings rate means two things at once. You need less to live, and you are accumulating capital faster. That is like pushing the accelerator while shortening the road. This is why I always find the national savings rate so depressing and so revealing. The average American savings rate is around 4.5% at that level. Retirement becomes difficult, not because markets are evil or because wages never rise or because you failed to discover a secret. It becomes difficult because you are simply not retaining enough of your output to create future freedom. You cannot retire on what you never keep. That is the fourth rule. Savings rate is one of the clearest bridges between your current life and your future freedom. If you are saving 15%, 20%, 25%, 30%, you are giving yourself a real chance. If you are saving 4% or 5%, then unless something unusual rescues you, a very high income, a huge inheritance, an extraordinary market outcome, or a pension, the path will be longer and much more fragile. Now let us use a practical example because examples make this all less abstract. Suppose you earn $100,000 a year. Suppose you save 40% of it. Suppose you already have $50,000 invested. In a simplified early retirement model that can put you somewhere around 15 years from financial independence under a 4.7% withdrawal framework. That means a person around 30 could, in theory, retire in the mid-40s. Now I want to stress the word theory, because theory is where a lot of people get hurt. It is easy to fall in love with calculator outputs. It is easy to think the future will proceed exactly as your spreadsheet says. It will not. Which brings me to the practical guide I would give anybody trying to figure this out, honestly. First, define your retirement preferences and accept that they will change. That is unavoidable. Maybe today you think you need $20,000 a year. Maybe in 5 years you realize you want $40,000. Maybe in 10 years you want $60,000. Maybe what you really want is not a minimalist retirement at all, but a flexible one where you can spend freely without stress. The numbers cannot be right if the target keeps changing and you never update the target. So you need to revisit the assumptions every year, especially if you are aiming for early retirement, where small changes in spending desires can dramatically change the whole timeline. Second, avoid life decisions that murder your compounding. This is where most people do violence to their own future without realizing it. Lifestyle creep is the obvious culprit: a fancier car, a bigger house, a habit of upgrading everything, a taste for recurring expenses that arrive softly and stay permanently. Then there are the more dramatic errors, the get-rich-quick schemes, the speculative leaps. The leverage used for vanity, the debt that eats your future before your future gets a chance to arrive. Compounding is powerful, but it is fragile in the face of foolish behavior. It needs time, it needs consistency, it needs retained capital. It does not survive endless self-sabotage. Third, plan the structure, not just the dream. If you want to retire early, but all your money is locked in retirement accounts you cannot touch without penalty until 59 and a half, then you do not actually have a retirement plan yet. You have a future tax issue. The bridge years matter. If you retire at 45, where does the money come from until the retirement accounts become accessible? That question has to be answered before you declare victory. The same goes for relationships and family. A partner changes the math. Their income matters. Their spending habits matter. Children matter enormously. I do not say that because children are a burden. I say it because they are expensive, and pretending otherwise is childish. Every major family choice interacts with your retirement speed, whether you like it or not. Fourth, keep your investment fees low. Do not try to time markets and do not carry bad debt. This sounds boring because it is boring. But boring is where fortunes get built. High fees quietly eat what compounding is trying to build. Market timing usually destroys discipline. Credit card debt is poison. Hard money borrowed for consumption is worse than slow progress because it moves you backward while pretending to move you forward. Now let us circle back to the original claim. Do you need $1.8 million to retire comfortably? Some people might if they spend a lot, if they want a large margin, if they have no outside income. If they live expensively, if they are conservative, then yes, they may genuinely need something in that neighborhood. But that is not the same as saying Americans need $1.8 million. Most do not. The real answer depends on how much you spend, what other income you have, what withdrawal rate you use, and how long you need the money to last. That is all. It is a more humble answer than a giant survey headline. It is also more useful. I have always preferred useful over dramatic. If you spend $40,000 a year and Social Security covers half of it, you do not need anything close to $1.8 million. If you want a traditional retirement and can live on modest spending, your number may be far lower than what the media wants you to fear. If you want an aggressive early retirement, then yes, you need a different level of discipline, a much higher savings rate, and much more planning. But in every case, the principle is the same. Figure out the life, figure out the income gap, figure out the withdrawal logic, then work backward, not the other way around. The strange thing about modern money talk is that people often let the loudest number in the room bully them into bad thinking. 1 year it is the house price. 1 year it is the salary number. 1 year it is the retirement number. They hear the number and immediately ask, can I ever get there? Instead of first asking whether it is even the right target. That is a mistake. A giant target that does not apply to your life is not ambitious. It is irrelevant. What matters is whether your math supports your life. That is what retirement planning really is. Not fear, not headlines, not survey theater, just arithmetic in service of a real human life. And if you can remember that, then the whole conversation gets calmer. You might still choose to save aggressively. I hope you do. You might still want a very large margin. I understand that too, but you will at least be building toward a number that means something, not just repeating a headline because everybody else looked frightened when they heard it. That is the difference between being influenced by retirement talk and actually understanding retirement math. One is emotional, the other is useful. I know which one I prefer. And if I had to leave you with one final thought, it would be this. The amount you need to retire comfortably is not a national average. It is a personal equation. The sooner you stop borrowing somebody else's number and start building your own, the sooner you begin doing real financial work instead of consuming financial entertainment.